The Jebel-es Zubla stretched like a narrow ridge, winding for over 50 miles. Its path traced across the land like a caterpillar inching from the southern edge to the north. From its striking red and white cliffs, the morning light revealed only the vast emptiness of the Arabian desert. There, in that timeless wilderness, the harsh east winds, feared by the vine growers of Jericho, had long made their home. At the base of the mountain, sands carried from the Euphrates had settled thickly, blown far from their source. And yet, the mountain stood resolute, like a sentinel wall guarding the fertile regions of Moab and Ammon to the west, lands that might otherwise have been consumed by the creeping desert. In the land south and east of Judea, the Arabic tongue had left its enduring mark. To the Arabs, this old mountain was known as the origin of countless wadis, dry riverbeds that slashed through the faint trace of an ancient Roman road. Once vibrant, the path now lay faded, serving as a dusty trail for Syrian pilgrims on their journeys to and from Mecca. These wadis deepened over time, guiding the seasonal torrents toward the Jordan River or into the stillness of the Dead Sea. From one such wadi, specifically the one that rose at the farthest end of the mountain and flowed east of north until it became the bed of the Jabbok River, a solitary traveler emerged. He was headed toward the high desert tablelands, and it is upon this man that the reader's attention must now rest. He appeared to be in his mid-40s. His thick beard, once pitch black, now bore streaks of white, spreading broadly across his chest. The sun-darkened hue of his face was partly concealed beneath a red keffiyeh, the traditional headdress still worn by desert dwellers today. His deep, dark eyes occasionally peered out, watchful and intense. Draped in the flowing robes common throughout the East, he traveled beneath the shade of a small tent, riding atop a majestic white dromedary. For those born in the West, the sight of a fully equipped camel, ready to face the desert, never truly loses its wonder. Even after years of living among the Bedouins, even after endless miles traveled with caravans, they still pause to watch this regal creature pass. It's not the shape that holds the gaze. It's not beautiful, not even in the eyes of affection. Nor is it the way it walks, soft-stepping, tilting from side to side. Rather, it is the desert itself, its mystery, its timeless silence that seems to dress the animal. In that single presence, we sense the vastness, the stillness, the stories untold. And perhaps that's where the true wonder lies. The dromedary emerging from the dry wadi was a striking example of this desert majesty. Towering, strong, its color bright and clean, feet broad, body thick with muscle, not fat, and a neck arch like swans. Its head, wide at the eyes, narrowed to a delicate muzzle. A lady's bracelet might nearly encircle it. With long, soundless strides, it moved with quiet strength. Every detail confirmed its pure Syrian bloodline, ancient, noble, priceless. Its bridle bore scarlet fringe, bronze chains at its throat, each chain ending in a tiny silver bell that chimed gently with every motion. No reins, no driver's strap. The seating on its back was ingeniously crafted. Two balanced wooden boxes lined with cushions and soft carpets, shaded by a green awning. Straps and knots held everything in place, ensuring comfort along the blistering roads of the wilderness. Roads traveled not only by duty, but by destiny. As the dromedary crested the last break in the wadi, the rider had crossed into El Belka, ancient Ammon. It was morning. The sun rose slowly behind a veil of mist. Before him lay not the endless dunes, but stony, wild land, where greenery thinned, granite boulders scattered, and camel grass clung on between thorny acacias. Behind him lay the trees, oak, bramble, arbutus, as though they had crept to the edge of this barren world, peered in, and refused to go further. There was no longer a path, no road, only open desert. The camel, as if guided by some ancient instinct, moved faster, its nose tilted to the horizon. Its chest swelled with the desert air. The green tint above swayed gently, like a boat rising and falling with waves. Dry leaves crunched beneath. Now and then, the breeze carried a bittersweet scent, like absinthe. Birds, lark, rock swallow, white partridge, scattered at the soundless approach. A fox or hyena darted away, curious but cautious. The Jebel Hills stood distant, their soft veil shifting from gray to deepening purple under the rising sun. High above, a vulture glided in slow circles. Yet the man beneath the awning, he saw none of it. Or, if he did, he showed no sign. His eyes, distant and quiet, stayed fixed ahead. Like his mount, he too was being led. 2 hours passed. The camel moved steadily, never breaking pace, always due east. The traveler didn't shift, didn't glance to the sides. In the desert, distance is measured not in miles, but in hours, sought, and halts, manzil. This was no ordinary beast. A camel of true Syrian stock could cover 3 leagues with ease, outrunning even the desert wind. As they moved swiftly, the landscape began to change. The Jebel faded, stretching like a blue ribbon on the western edge. Small hills, tells, rose here and there. Basalt rocks, round and dark, marked the border between mountain and plain. Otherwise, there was only sand, sometimes smooth as a shoreline, sometimes rippled like waves, or thrown in gentle swells. The air grew warmer. The sun, now high, had drunk the mist from the sky, painting the earth in a pale, milky light, and warming the breeze that kissed the traveler beneath his shade. 2 more hours passed. Still no stop, no change in course. The vegetation vanished entirely. The crusted sand crackled beneath each step. The Jebel had disappeared. No landmark remained. The traveler's shadow, once behind him, now moved alongside, racing him. And still, no sign of rest. Stranger and stranger his journey became. None enters the desert for pleasure. Only life and necessity move across its barren paths. Paths littered with the bones of what came before. Roads from one well to another. Pasture to pasture. Even the bravest sheik feels his heart stir when he finds himself alone in the endless silence. This man was no wanderer, nor did he act like one in flight. He never once looked back. He showed no fear, no curiosity. In isolation, men often turn to animals for comfort, speak to their dogs, pat their horses. But this man offered his camel nothing. Not a word, not a touch. Then, precisely at noon, the dromedary halted on its own. It let out a soft, pleading cry, a deep moan, the kind only a camel makes when its burden grows too heavy or when it seeks rest. The rider moved at last, as if waking from a long dream. He lifted the curtain of his little tent, gazed at the sun, and scanned the horizon carefully, seeking a sign. Then, with a slow, deep breath, he nodded, as if to say yes at last. He crossed his hands over his chest, bowed his head, and prayed in silence. When his prayer was done, he prepared to dismount. From his throat came a sound, soft and deep. Ik, ik, an old command known to the camels of Job. Slowly, the beast obeyed, groaning as it bent its legs. Gently, the man stepped down onto the sand and stood still. The man, now fully revealed, was striking in form, broad, strong, and full of silent power. He wasn't particularly tall, but his presence held the weight of command. Unwinding the silken rope that secured the keffiyeh on his head, he pushed back the folds until his face was uncovered, deeply hued, nearly dark as bronze. Yet the shape of his features, his broad forehead, the sharp, aquiline nose, the eyes that lifted slightly at the corners, betrayed a heritage impossible to mistake. His hair, thick and straight, gleamed with a metallic sheen and fell to his shoulders in long plaits. There was a timelessness to his face, echoing the ancient kings of Egypt, like Pharaoh's long gone, or Mizraim, father of that very race. He wore a white cotton tunic, the camas, its sleeves tight and front open, reaching down to his ankle, delicately embroidered along the collar and chest. Over this, a brown woolen cloak draped around him, its inner lining of mixed cotton and silk, edged with a faint, clouded yellow. Sandals wrapped his feet, secured by soft leather straps. A sash bound the tunic at his waist. What struck most, especially in such a dangerous wilderness, was the absence of any weapon. No sword, no knife, not even the common crooked staff used for herding camels. One could only guess his journey must be peaceful, or he traveled with some unseen, divine protection. Exhausted from the long ride, his limbs stiff, he began to stamp his feet gently and rub his hands for warmth. Then, circling his resting camel, whose eyes, heavy with calm, slowly closed as it chewed its cud, he scanned the horizon. With a hand lifted to shade his eyes, he searched the boundless desert in every direction. And every time his search ended, a faint disappointment crossed his face. Subtle, yet enough to reveal he was waiting for someone, perhaps by arrangement, perhaps by divine leading. But one thing was clear: this place, far from any village or road, was chosen for something more than mere rest. Despite the silence, there was no uncertainty in his posture. He truly believed the one he awaited would come. In quiet preparation, he returned to his litter. From its opposite compartment, he took out a sponge and a small water vessel. Gently, he washed the camel's face, its eyes, nostrils, and mouth. Then he brought out a striped cloth, a bundle of rods, and a sturdy cane. The cane, cleverly built of nested sections, extended to form a central tent pole, taller than the man himself. Around it, he arranged the rods, covered them with the striped cloth, and created a small but dignified tent. A home, not grand, but sufficient. He laid down a square rug inside, covering the shaded floor. Once more, he stepped outside, eyes sharp, gaze sweeping across the sun-bleached horizon. Except for a lone jackal far away and an eagle gliding toward the Gulf of Aqaba, the world around him remained still and lifeless. Lowering his voice, he spoke, not to another man, but to the camel at his side, and perhaps to himself, in a language foreign to this land. His words were gentle, an offering of trust. They were far from home, but faith sustained them. With care, he took beans from the saddle and placed them into a nose bag for the camel. Watching his companion eat with quiet satisfaction, he turned again toward the glowing expanse. The sun was high, the air heavy with silence. But he believed. He whispered softly to himself. He knew they would come. He had not come here alone by chance. The one who brought him here was guiding them, too. And so, he began to prepare. From the cot's many pouches and a woven willow basket, he brought out the makings of a shared meal. Platters made from palm fibers, wineskin flasks, dried mutton, sweet Syrian pomegranates without seeds, the rich dates of El Shelabai, soft white cheese, and warm loaves of leavened bread. He arranged them carefully beneath the tent, and around the food, he laid out 3 strips of silk, each a place of honor for a guest's knees, subtle but clear. He was not alone. He was expecting 2 others. Then he stepped out, and there, far to the east, a small speck emerged on the desert's edge, at first faint, then growing larger, until it became a shape, a silhouette familiar. Another white dromedary, tall and graceful, came into view, carrying a Hindustani-style litter. The man's breath caught, his eyes widened. A chill brushed his skin, not from fear, but from the awe of prophecy fulfilled. Hands folded upon his chest, he looked toward the sky, a silent prayer on his lips, a prayer full of wonder and reverence. As the new traveler approached, the camel knelt. The man standing at the tent watched, calm and still. The rider paused. He Two seemed to feel the sacredness of the moment. Dismounting, he stepped forward, and they met. They did not speak. They embraced instead, right arms across each other's shoulders, left arms wrapping the side, heads bowed upon one another's chests. There was peace and recognition, not just of one another, but of a shared calling. The second traveler was tall, gaunt, with deep-set eyes, white hair, and a complexion touched by years under the sun, like cinnamon warmed by bronze. His garments, Hindustani in style, resembled those of the first man, save for a shorter outer cloak and flowing trousers. Instead of sandals, he wore soft red slippers that curled slightly at the toe. Everything else, his turban, tunic, cloak, was pure white. He carried no weapon, only the air of one deeply devoted. His presence recalled ancient sages of the East, men soaked in the silence of prayer and fasting, men like Visvamitra, saints of the Vedic past. Yet even in his solemnity, his eyes held something human, moist with tears. And just as the embrace ended, he whispered again, soft, reverent, a line not unfamiliar, but echoed now by another soul. Together, they turned their eyes northward. Another figure approached, one more dromedary, white like the others, gliding through the sands like a ship at sea. The two stood together, waiting, not in fear, but in faith. And soon, the third traveler arrived. He dismounted, stepped forward, and embraced the Hindu with the same reverence and love. And again, no long words, only surrender. Peace had come, and with it purpose. The third traveler arrived, distinctly different from the others. His build was more slender, his complexion fair, his golden hair soft and wavy, forming a luminous crown over his refined, noble head. His deep blue eyes radiated warmth, eyes that revealed a gentle soul, yet firm with quiet courage. He came unarmed, without even a head covering. Draped over his frame was a Tyrian blanket, worn not with pride, but with effortless grace. Beneath it, he wore a simple tunic, short-sleeved and loose at the neck, bound at the waist, and flowing just above the knees. His arms, neck, and legs were bare. Sandals protected his feet from the scorching earth. Though his years likely numbered 50, perhaps more, he bore them lightly. Time had not diminished his vitality, only refined his presence, lending him a thoughtful calmness. His spirit remained unclouded, vibrant. One needed no introduction to sense his origin. He may not have walked the groves of Athens himself, but his ancestry surely had. When their embrace ended, the Egyptian, his voice unsteady with feeling, recognized his purpose among them. He had arrived first, drawn by a higher calling, and so he believed himself chosen to serve the others. The tent was prepared, the bread laid out. With quiet humility, he took the hands of each guest, led them inside, removed their sandals, and gently washed their feet. Then he poured water over their hands, drying them with care. Cleansing himself last, he spoke with reverence, acknowledging the sacredness of their task and the strength they would need to fulfill it. And so, they sat down together, seated to face one another. With heads bowed and hands crossed over their hearts, they offered thanks, not as strangers, but as brothers. Each spoke the same prayer, though in words foreign to the others. Yet each one understood, perfectly, deeply. Their voices joined in unison, but their tongues differed. Still, the meaning was clear to all. It was no ordinary moment. It was a sign, and in that miracle, their hearts stirred with awe, for they knew they were in the presence of the divine. To speak as they did in ancient times, the meeting of these three souls took place in the year 747 of Rome. It was the month of December, and winter, in all its quiet authority, blanketed the lands east of the Mediterranean. In this season, the desert traveler, after only a short journey, finds himself gripped by hunger, and those gathered beneath that modest tent were no exception. They ate heartily, as men weary and grateful. And once the wine had warmed them, they began to speak. The Egyptian, seated with the calm dignity of one chosen to guide, turned toward the others. He spoke softly, his words carrying both wisdom and welcome. For him, there was sweetness in hearing one's name upon the lips of a friend, especially in a foreign land. He reminded them that many days of shared travel lay ahead, and so the time had come to know each other. With a gentle gesture, he invited the last traveler to speak first. And so, with slow thoughtfulness, like one still uncertain of how much to reveal, the Greek began. His voice held awe. The tale he was about to tell seemed so strange, even to himself, that he struggled to find a beginning. But one thing burned clear within him. He was fulfilling the will of a master, and that service, that obedience, was no burden. It was joy, pure, overwhelming joy. Whenever he reflected upon the purpose he had been sent to fulfill, a divine gladness swelled inside him, one that confirmed the hand of God was indeed guiding him. He paused for a moment, his eyes lowered, overcome by the weight of it all. Then, lifting his voice again, he spoke of a land far to the west, a land that, in its greatness, could never be forgotten, not simply for its beauty or its warriors, but for its gifts to the world, gifts of art, of thought, of poetry, of language refined until it sang like music. That land was Greece, and he, the man speaking now, was named Gasper, son of Cleanthes of Athens. His family had long been devoted to study, and from them, he had inherited a deep hunger for truth. Among the many teachings of the philosophers, he had set apart two, teachings that stirred his soul beyond all others. One claimed that every man bore within him a soul, immortal and sacred. The other held that there was but one God, just, eternal, and absolute. From the countless debates that filled the schools of Athens, he chose only these two to pursue, for he felt, deep within, that there must be some divine connection between the soul and that one true God. He had reasoned as far as reason could go. Then, he had reached the wall, that impassable barrier where the mind can go no further. And in that moment of helplessness, he cried out. No voice answered. In despair, he turned his back on the cities, the schools, the comforts of home. He went into solitude. At these words, a faint smile, calm and knowing, touched the austere face of the Hindu. The Greek continued. He had traveled north into Thessaly. There stood Mount Olympus, the mythical home of the gods. And there, near a bend in the mountain slope, he found a small cave where he made his dwelling. He gave himself entirely to silence, to longing, to prayer. Every breath he drew became a plea for revelation. He believed, truly believed, that if he yearned for God with all his soul, God would take pity and answer. And he did. The Greek's voice wavered, but then he steadied himself and continued. From the mouth of his cave, he could see the sea, the Gulf of Thermaic stretching out like a silver sheet. One day, a man was cast from a passing ship and swam to shore. Gasper helped him, cared for him. The man was a Jew, learned, wise in the ancient history and sacred laws of his people. From this man, Gasper learned something astonishing. The very God he had been praying to truly existed. A lawgiver, a ruler, a king of an ancient people. That was the revelation he had begged for. And in that moment, he understood his faith had not been in vain. But that was not all. The Jew told him of the prophets, messengers of old who had walked with God and who foretold that God would one day return. He shared their names, their writings, even quoted their words from sacred texts. And then he spoke something even more incredible. The return of God was near, imminent, awaited at that very moment in the city of Jerusalem. Gasper fell silent. A shadow dimmed the brightness of his expression. He remembered something that troubled him. The Jew had insisted that the coming king was only for the Jews. No blessing, No salvation was meant for the rest of the world. They alone were the chosen. But Gasper's hope remained unshaken. How could such a God, just and eternal, limit his love to one people, one nation? No, he believed there had to be more. He questioned, he pressed, and eventually he learned the deeper truth that the Jews had only been the keepers, the guardians of a truth meant for the world. When the Jew departed, Gasper remained. Alone once more, he began a new prayer, one unlike any before. He asked not for knowledge, but for the chance to see the coming king with his own eyes and to worship him. Then one night, while sitting before his cave, trying to pierce the mystery of his own existence, he saw something from the sea, or perhaps from the dark sky above it. A star began to burn. Slowly, steadily, it rose, drawing closer, until it stood above his door. Its light touched his face, and he fell into sleep. And in that dream, a voice spoke. It called his name, told him that his faith had triumphed, that he had been chosen, along with 2 others from distant lands, to witness the promised one, to give testimony, to bear witness before the world. The voice instructed him to rise in the morning and begin his journey. And so he did. With light in his soul brighter than the sun, he cast off his hermit's robe, dressed once more as a man of the world, and took the treasure he had long hidden away. He boarded a passing ship, landed at Antioch, bought his camel and its gear, traveled through the gardens of Orontes, through Emesa, Damascus, Bostra, Philadelphia, and finally reached the place where they now sat. That was his journey, his calling, and now his story was told. And in the quiet that followed, he looked to his brothers, ready now to listen. The Egyptian and the Hindu exchanged a silent understanding, a simple wave from the former, and a respectful bow from the latter marked the beginning of a solemn moment. With a composed breath, the Hindu began to speak from the depth of his spirit. He identified himself as Melchior, and though his words were simple, they carried the weight of ancient knowledge. He spoke in a language known as Sanskrit, one of the earliest tongues to ever be shaped into written form. His identity as a Hindu wasn't just a cultural label. It was a lineage tied to the very dawn of human learning. His people had been among the first to explore the vast fields of wisdom, to organize them, and to craft beauty within them. He recalled the 4 Vedas, ancient texts that would forever remain as sacred wells of knowledge and spiritual guidance. From these sprang the Upavedas, offered by Brahma himself, touching on medicine, archery, architecture, music, and numerous other skills. Then came the Vedangas, divinely inspired works that reach into the realms of astronomy, grammar, religious rites, and spiritual incantations. The Upangas followed, authored by the sage Vyasa, delving into the nature of the universe, time, geography, and preserving stories like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which enshrine the tales of gods and legendary warriors. These great Shastras were once the pride of his heritage, but now they felt lifeless to him. Still, he acknowledged their brilliance, the promise of a people reaching toward perfection. Yet something had gone wrong. He lamented how the very texts meant to inspire had become barriers to progress. The belief that everything man needed had already been given had locked the door to invention and discovery. That notion, sacred as it was, dimmed the brilliance of Hindu creativity, as if a sacred lamp had been lowered into a deep well, forever trapped within narrow walls and bitter shadows. His reflection wasn't shared from pride. He humbly reminded his brethren that these teachings acknowledged a supreme being, Brahm, and the sacred poems within the Puranas echoed virtues like goodness, divine purpose, and the eternal soul. Long before other civilizations emerged, the concepts of God and soul had already taken root in the Hindu mind. Brahm, as he explained, was seen as a divine triad, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma, the creator, had not only birthed humanity, but also defined its order through the creation of four castes. From Brahma's mouth came the Brahmins, the highest, teachers of sacred wisdom. From his arms came warriors, from his chest, the producers of life, farmers, shepherds, merchants, and from his feet, the Sudras, those fated to serve. These roles were bound by sacred law. No caste could cross into another. Even a Brahmin, if fallen, became an outcast, severed from all but others like himself. As these harsh truths unfolded, the Greek listener, overcome by the implications of such a system, could only reflect on the dire need for divine love. The Egyptian agreed, echoing that longing. The Hindu's brow furrowed deeply. After a pause, he continued, his voice softer, carrying a weight of memory. He had been born into the Brahmin caste. From his very first breath, his life had followed strict rituals. Every act, whether drinking water, seeing sunlight for the first time, or receiving his sacred thread, was governed by unyielding tradition. He lived within the first phase of life, the student's path, where every detail was scripted, every mistake a threat to his soul. Each failure to uphold the law carried consequences, not in this world, but the next. Depending on the severity, his soul might ascend to one of many heavens, or fall, to return as an insect, a fish, or a beast. Salvation, for the obedient, was not an existence, but a final rest, a disappearance into the essence of Brahm. As time passed, he entered the second phase, the householder's life. And then, something changed. He began to question everything, even Brahm. The certainty he had once embraced began to fracture. From the darkness of the well, he saw a faint light above and longed to reach it. That yearning carried him through years of struggle. And finally, he found it. He discovered love. The revelation lit his aged face, his hands clasped with sudden passion. For him, love was more than emotion. It was movement. It was action. A truth measured not by words, but by sacrifice. He could no longer ignore the cries of the Sudra, or the broken souls crushed under the weight of tradition. He journeyed to Ganga Lager, where the sacred Ganges meets the Indian Ocean. In the temple of Kapila, surrounded by pious disciples, he sought rest. But every visit from desperate pilgrims only deepened his compassion and intensified his silence. He knew the danger of speaking. To question Brahm or the triad was heresy. To bless an outcast, to offer water to the dying, was to join them. Yet, love triumphed. He spoke, and for that, he was driven from the temple, stoned by the pilgrims, hunted across the land. He found no peace, even among the outcasts, for though rejected, they too still believed. In desperation, he turned to the Himalayas, seeking solitude in the highest reaches of the earth. As he followed the Ganges to its source, he wept for his people and prayed for their deliverance. At the lake Lang Tso, beneath the eternal peaks of Gerla and Kailas, he found his sanctuary. There, surrounded by silence and beauty untouched by time, he waited, fasting, praying, longing for death. Then, one night, as he walked beside the still waters, he cried out to the silence, pleading for redemption. A trembling light shimmered over the lake. A star appeared. It moved toward him until it stood directly above. The brilliance overwhelmed him. He fell to the ground, and in that moment, he heard a voice, not of thunder, but of infinite sweetness. It told him his love had conquered, and that he was chosen. Along with two others from far parts of the world, he would see the Redeemer and bear witness to his coming. He was told to trust the Spirit that would lead him. From that night, the light never left him. It was the Spirit's sign. He retraced his steps through Herd War, where he found a precious stone and sold it. His journey led through Lahore, Kabul, Yes, to Ispahan, where he bought a camel, then traveled alone to Baghdad, guided by faith, untouched by fear. Even now, the Spirit remained with him, and with quiet awe, he marveled what glory awaited them. To see the Redeemer, to speak with him, to worship him. And with that, he ended. The Greek, full of life and enthusiasm, expressed his heartfelt joy and admiration. The Egyptian, ever solemn and composed, offered his reverence in return, acknowledging the trials his companions had endured and the victory they had achieved. With the quiet grace of a man long acquainted with wisdom, he excused himself briefly to tend to the camels. Upon returning, he seated himself again and began to speak, not with pomp, but with a quiet authority that commanded respect. He introduced himself as Balthasar the Egyptian and, with words resonating with spiritual depth, he began to share the story of his people and the sacred heritage they bore. He described Egypt not just as a nation, but as the birthplace of recorded history. While others relied on traditions or poetry, his ancestors preserved events in stone, in temple walls, on tombs, and on fragile papyri, inscriptions not of legend but of certainty. They chronicled the reigns of kings, the wisdom of philosophers, and the profound mysteries of their faith, all except for one great secret yet to be revealed. The teachings of the soul and its journey, the concept of an eternal creator, and the sacred texts of his people, like the Book of the Dead, were older than the scriptures of India, older than Homer or Plato, older even than the Hebrew Genesis, recorded first by Menes, their earliest king. He paused, his gaze resting gently on the Greek, drawing attention to a profound truth. The teachers of ancient Greece had once been taught by the Egyptians. With growing warmth, Balthasar explained how the knowledge brought from the distant East of God and the undying soul was carried across deserts to the banks of the Nile. In those early days, before corruption crept in, worship was pure and simple, a joyful song and a sincere prayer, born from love of the Creator. The light of understanding deepened among his companions as he continued, defining religion not as ritual, but as the sacred bond between man and his Maker. Pure religion, in its origin, was formed of three truths: the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and their recognition of one another. From this holy trinity came worship, love, and divine reward. Just as the sun holds the earth in place through unseen laws, so did the Creator bind man through the laws of faith, perfect and simple. But humanity, unable to accept such simplicity, distorted what was once perfect. He paused to gather his thoughts, then reflected on Egypt's long and troubled spiritual journey. Many peoples had passed through the Nile Valley: the Ethiopian, the Hebrew, the Persian, the Roman, and each left their mark. The pure faith of Mizraim became diluted, transformed into a pantheon of gods. The Creator was splintered into multiple deities, each assigned to natural forces: water, fire, air, and later, to human qualities like knowledge and strength. Animals were worshipped as divine vessels: the cat for Re, the bull for Isis, the beetle for Ta. Great monuments rose, pyramids, tombs, and labyrinths, but beneath their grandeur lay a decline into spiritual confusion. For a moment, emotion crept into the Egyptian's voice, though his expression remained calm. He urged his companions not to judge his people too harshly, for not all had abandoned God. He revealed that the deepest secret of their faith had been withheld from papyri, a tale of a pharaoh who tried to erase the old ways. During his reign, the Hebrews, then slaves in Egypt, remained loyal to their own God. When oppression became unbearable, they were led to freedom in a miraculous way. The records told of a Hebrew named Moshe who came to the pharaoh with a divine demand to release his people. The ruler refused, And so a series of calamities fell upon the land. Waters turned to blood, plagues spread, livestock died, locusts consumed the crops, and darkness covered the day. Yet Pharaoh remained unyielding until the final plague struck down every firstborn in Egypt. Only then did he relent. But even then, as the Hebrews fled, he pursued them. At the sea's edge, the waters parted for the slaves to pass. When Pharaoh's army followed, the sea closed in, destroying king and soldier alike. With calm conviction, Balthasar reminded them, this was no legend, but written in the ancient records. The Greek, overwhelmed with inspiration, showed the spark of recognition in his bright eyes, having heard the same tale from a Jew long before. But the Egyptian clarified that it was not the words of Moshe he carried, but rather the voice of Egypt itself, spoken through carved stone and sacred memory. The ancient priests had preserved their witness, and through him, that revelation endured. Then, gently, he brought forth the one truth that had never been committed to scroll or monument. Egypt had always held two faiths, one public, filled with many gods for the people, and another private, guarded by the priesthood, devoted to the belief in one Almighty. Despite centuries of conquest and corruption, despite kings and invaders, that singular truth had survived, like a seed hidden in stone, waiting for its moment. And now, at last, its hour had come. A hush fell over the others, as joy stirred in their hearts. The Egyptian paused only to refresh himself with water before recounting his own path. Born in Alexandria, a prince and a priest, he had received the highest education of his class. Yet a profound discontent grew within him. His inherited beliefs taught that the soul, upon death, returned to lower forms, climbing back toward humanity without regard for the life it had led. But when he heard of the Persian vision of paradise, where only the virtuous would cross the bridge of light to heaven, his thoughts shifted forever. He pondered deeply, if God is just, how could the wicked and the righteous share the same fate? In time, he saw clearly, true religion demanded accountability. Death, he realized, was a passage, not an end, and beyond it lay not rest, but a living joy, life eternal with God, full of light and motion. This revelation drove him to question why such truth had been kept secret, reserved only for priests. With philosophy growing and tyranny fading, he believed the time for concealment was over. He took his message to the streets of Alexandria. In the bustling quarter of Berkium, filled with scholars, priests, and wanderers from east and west, he preached to the one God, of right and wrong, and of heaven as the reward of the good. But his words were met with scorn. While Melchior had been stoned, he was mocked, his faith twisted into jokes, his heaven painted as fantasy. Still, he did not surrender. He sought the source of his failure and found it not in the message, but in the audience. Leaving the city behind, he sailed up the river to a humble village of farmers. There, he spoke again, this time to the poor, to those unspoiled by pride. They listened, believed, and spread his words. A prayer society was born. Under the stars, floating down the Nile, he understood the truth. Change must begin not among the powerful, but with the humble, whose hearts are open. He secured his wealth to aid the needy and dedicated his life to traveling from village to village, proclaiming righteousness, the one God, and the promise of heaven. And through this journey, he sensed the world was ripening for someone greater yet to come. Still, the thought haunted him. What would happen when he was gone? Could his work endure? He dreamed of building a lasting movement, but it failed. He understood then that the world had become too clouded by myth, too filled with false gods across earth and sky. Only one with divine proof could restore the first faith. Not merely a prophet, but one who was God, come in person, with signs that no man could deny. He would have to lead his followers through suffering and persecution, even unto death. Only such a figure could awaken the world. Moved by the weight of this truth, the three men felt a deep, shared conviction. The Greek recognized the moment they were living, and the Egyptian continued, explaining that he lacked the authority to found a lasting faith. Prayer had become his answer. He left civilization, going beyond the fifth cataract, past the confluence of rivers in center, and deep into the heart of Africa. There, by a mountain that poured its snowy waters into a lake, source of Nile, he lived in solitude. Palm fruits fed his body, and unbroken prayer nourished his spirit. One night, beside the starlit waters, he cried out to God, longing for the redemption of the world. Then a star seemed to descend from the heavens, hovering close. A divine voice spoke to him, blessing his works and promising that the Savior was near. He was told that with two others, he would see the Redeemer and testify for him. Guided by the Spirit, he traveled through Memphis, Suez, and the lands of Moab and Ammon, never pausing until he reached this moment, this gathering. They rose as one, their hearts stirred by a force beyond themselves. The Egyptian reminded them why each had shared the story of their homeland and heritage. The one they sought was called the King of the Jews, but he was far more than that. The sons of Noah had repopulated the world after the flood. One lineage settled the east, another flowed into Europe, and the third crossed into Africa. Though many of them remained nomads, some had become builders along the Nile. The truth they now followed was not bound by tribe or title. It was destined for all nations. The Savior they were seeking would not redeem one people, but all of humanity. In a moment of shared understanding, the three men clasped hands, moved by something greater than themselves. There was a divine rhythm to the way their paths had converged, too perfect to be chance. The elder, reflecting deeply, believed that once they had discovered the long-promised Redeemer, generations to come would kneel beside them in reverence. And when they would eventually part and return to their separate lives, the world would carry away a new revelation. That the path to heaven is not forged through violence or intellect, but through unwavering faith, pure love, and selfless good works. A hush followed, soft, sacred, and tender, interrupted only by quiet sighs and tears. It was the kind of joy that words cannot hold, the kind that lives on the edge of eternity, as if their souls had reached the shore of the river of life, resting among the redeemed, basking in the nearness of God. At last, their hands drifted apart, and they stepped out into the calm stillness of the desert. The sky stretched wide and hushed above them. The sun was nearly gone, casting its final light. Even the camels slept in perfect silence. Soon after, the tent was taken down, and the remaining food and belongings returned to the humble cot. Without delay, the travelers mounted their camels, riding one behind the other, guided by the Egyptian at the front. They moved westward into the growing chill of night. The camels trotted forward in rhythmic harmony, each step so precise that the followers seemed to walk in the exact impressions of the one ahead. Not a word passed between them. Then, slowly, the moon rose, silvering the desert with its quiet glow. The three riders, draped in white, moved silently through the light, their figures ghostly against the night, like spirits fleeing from shadows long endured. Suddenly, a soft, flickering light appeared ahead, hovering just above a low hilltop. As they watched, the light narrowed and intensified into a brilliant, blinding point. Their hearts pounded. Something deep within them stirred and trembled. And then, overcome by awe and certainty, their voices lifted in perfect unity, not as a shout, but as a sacred exclamation carried on breath and belief. The star had come. God was truly with them. Within a narrow opening in Jerusalem's western wall, there hung the great wooden doors known as the Bethlehem, or Joppa Gate. Just beyond them stretched one of the city's most notable gathering places. Centuries before King David's eyes fell longingly upon Zion, a citadel had already stood here. When the son of Jesse finally overthrew the Jebusite and began his grand constructions, the old citadel became part of the northwest corner of Jerusalem's new walls. Towering above it stood a formidable structure, far grander than the one that came before. Yet the gate itself remained untouched. Most likely, it was because the intersecting roads that met in front of it could not be easily redirected. Moreover, the space outside had long served as a thriving market. Even in Solomon's era, this place bustled with trade, from Egyptian merchants to wealthy dealers from Tyre and Sidon. Nearly 3,000 years had passed, and still, a sense of commerce clung to the place. It was a spot where pilgrims could find nearly anything, from pins to pistols, cucumbers to camels, homes to horses, loans to lentils, dates to guides, melons to men, doves to donkeys. Everything was asked for. Everything was offered. At times, the atmosphere turned so lively, it stirred visions of what the market must have been like during the reign of Herod the Builder. And it was to that very era the reader was now being taken. According to the Hebrew calendar, the meeting of the wise men, described earlier, took place in the afternoon of the 25th day of the third month. That translated to the 25th of December. The year was the second of the 193rd Olympiad, the 747th year of Rome, the 67th of Herod the Great, and the 35th of his rule, 4 years before the beginning of the Christian era. In Judea, hours of the day began with sunrise, marking the first hour as the one immediately after dawn. And so, at that very hour, the Joppa Gate market was already in full motion, vibrant and loud. Since early morning, the heavy wooden gates had been thrown wide open. Business, always forceful, spilled through the stone archway into a narrow lane and court. This lane hugged the massive tower walls before winding further into the city's heart. High in the hills, Jerusalem's morning air was sharp and brisk. The sun's warm rays lingered stubbornly on the tops of turrets and battlements, refusing to descend. From those heights came the cooing of pigeons and the flutter of wings as flocks moved about in gentle rhythm. To understand the unfolding story, one must first pause here, at the gate, and take in the people of this sacred city, both locals and strangers. Their faces and moods would later shift. But here, in the market's hum, their present selves could be fully seen. At first, it was all chaos, movements, voices, colors, textures, all clashing, especially within the lane and court, where the uneven stone paving amplified every shout, every hoofbeat, every jostling cart. But with time, the pattern became clearer. There stood a donkey, half asleep under heavy baskets filled with lentils, beans, onions, and cucumbers, freshly harvested from Galilee's gardens. Its owner, dressed in the simplest garb, a coarse, undyed cloth draped across his shoulder and tied at the waist, called out for customers in a voice only the seasoned market-goers could decipher. Nearby, a camel knelt, far more imposing. It was bony and rugged, with tufts of fox-colored hair clinging to its neck and sides. Upon its massive saddle rested a strange pile of boxes and baskets. Its master, a wiry Egyptian, dust-colored from endless roads, wore a worn tarbush and a loose, sleeveless tunic that dropped from neck to knee. His feet were bare, and his stride unbothered. He paced with quiet persistence, loosely holding the camel's tether, while calling out about the fruits from Kedron's orchards: grapes, dates, figs, apples, and pomegranates. The camel groaned restlessly beneath its burden, baring its teeth now and then, but the man paid it no mind. At a bend where the lane widened into a court, some women sat, backs pressed to the gray stone walls. They wore long linen robes, tied loosely at the waist, and their veils wrapped both head and shoulders. In front of them were clay jars and leather bottles, the kind used to fetch water from faraway wells. Among these vessels, half-naked children rolled and played, oblivious to the cold or the crowd. With their dark eyes, brown skin, and jet-black hair, they were unmistakably children of Israel. Occasionally, one of the mothers would lift her veil and softly offer her wares, honey of grapes from the bottles, and strong drink from the jars. But their quiet voices were drowned out by the larger noise, and they struggled to compete with louder, bolder rivals. Men with long beards, bare legs, and bottles tied to their backs, shouting with force, trying to draw attention to their wines from En-Gedi. In another corner, dealers in birds stood out, offering doves, ducks, pigeons, and sometimes the melodious bulbul. As buyers exchanged coins for creatures, thoughts drifted to the brave climbers who caught them, dangling from cliffs, suspended in baskets, risking all for each bird. Amidst them moved jewel peddlers, draped in scarlet and blue, their white turbans towering above them. They moved with purpose, their eyes sharp, aware of how even the glint of a bracelet or a ribbon could change a sale. Beside them, other vendors hawked household wares, clothing, perfumes, and items both ordinary and exotic. Animals brayed, bleated, and bellowed. Horses, sheep, goats, donkeys, and camels shuffled through the crowd. Only swine were missing, shunned by the faith of the land. This was not a quiet place, nor was it sparse. Every image described was repeated again and again, not in isolation, but scattered everywhere. And yet, to truly understand the moment, one had to look beyond the narrow street, to the open space outside the gate. There, the market grew even more colorful, more dynamic. With tents, booths, open sky, and the golden brilliance of eastern sunlight, the crowd felt freer, louder, and more alive. Standing just at the edge of the twin streams, one flowing into the gate, the other out, a quiet vantage point offered a perfect place to observe. It didn't take long before two striking figures emerged, catching the eye with their presence and bearing. One of them, clad in armor with a polished breastplate and a bronze helmet, appeared visibly chilled. He moved with the confidence of a seasoned warrior. The man beside him dropped the hood of his military cloak, exposing a face sharpened by irony. Their voices carried memories of places far away, of snow-covered victories and distant vaults said to lead into the underworld. They vanished through the entrance, but even without words, their armor and powerful stride declared them Roman soldiers. Not far behind came a solitary figure, a Jew, thin and stooped, wrapped in a rough brown robe. A heavy mat of tangled, unkempt hair flowed from his head down his back. His presence stirred unease. Some laughed as he passed, while others simply turned away. He was a Nazirite, part of a ridiculed sect that rejected the authority of Moses' books, took upon themselves severe vows, and refused to cut their hair until those vows were fulfilled. Suddenly, the crowd shifted. A ripple of commotion moved through the people, parting left and right. All eyes turned to the source, a man draped in snow-white linen, his head wrapped with yellow silk cords, and his robe adorned with rich embroidery. A red sash with golden fringes circled his waist. His expression was calm, even gracious, despite the crude reaction of the crowd. He wasn't a leper, just a Samaritan. Yet to those around him, that was enough. They saw him as impure, untouchable. Even life-saving aid from him would be rejected by an Israelite. The bitterness between Jews and Samaritans stretched back generations, rooted in tribal divisions that outlasted kings, temples, and time itself. Even under Herod, who welcomed converts from across the world, the Samaritans remained forever excluded. As he walked through the archway, 3 men exited, towering in size, rippling with raw strength. They looked nothing like the others who had passed. Their pale skin gleamed, their short, Light hair clung close to their heads, and their necks were thick and powerful like tree trunks. They wore sleeveless tunics, open at the chest, loose around their waists. Their limbs were muscular, bare, and built for battle. These were gladiators, fighters trained in wrestling, swordplay, and running. Such men, once unknown in Judea, now roamed freely under Roman influence. Perhaps they were from Caesarea or Sebaste, or even Jericho, where Herod, in his love for Greek culture and Roman spectacle, built grand theaters and trained warriors from Gallic or Slavic tribes. Their presence was fierce. One raised a clenched fist and boasted of crushing skulls with ease. The brutal expression was enough to turn away the gaze. Something gentler was needed. Just across the way, a fruit stand stood quietly. Its owner, bald with a hawk-like nose and long face, sat cross-legged on a carpet. Boxes of grapes, almonds, figs, and pomegranates surrounded him, arranged neatly on stools. A thin curtain offered shade, while the wall at his back provided rest. Toward him came another figure, this one impossible to ignore, though not for the same reasons as the gladiators. He was striking in a different way, elegant and beautiful. A young Greek, with a crown of myrtle around his dark waves, still speckled with pale blossoms and berries. His tunic, deep scarlet and soft as wool, hung gracefully. A golden clasp fastened a buff-colored girdle at his waist. A scarf of white and yellow crossed his chest and flowed behind him. His exposed skin, smooth and ivory pale, bore the sheen of careful grooming, bath oils, and scented powders. The fruit seller leaned forward, lifting his hands in a formal greeting. The Greek's gaze passed over the fruits, speaking lightly of hunger and taste. The merchant, with a nasal tone, offered his finest from Epidus, fruit said to restore the voices of singers in Antioch. Yet the Greek only smiled. He scoffed gently at the singers' cold voices and reminded the merchant of a gift from Salome herself, a sign of nobility and divine taste. Grapes, he requested, and nothing more. Dates, he refused. They belonged to Arabs. Figs, he declined. Those were for Jews. Only the grapes, he said, held the true essence of Greek blood mingled with the vine. In the heart of the bustling market, where dust clung to every surface and voices rose in a heated chorus of trade, one figure stood apart. A courtly singer, elegant despite the grime, sang with such poise and presence that his image lingered long in the memory. Yet, before that impression could settle, another presence drew the eye. A solemn man moving slowly through the road, eyes downcast, every few steps halting to cross his hands upon his breast. His face turned skyward, as though lifting his soul in prayer. Only in Jerusalem, it seemed, could one find such a figure, a Pharisee, marked by his leathern phylacteries on brow and arm, the heavy fringes of his robe, and a sanctimonious air so palpable it seemed to cling to him. More than a man, he was a symbol of devotion turned to display, of piety soon to shape the fate of nations with rigid zeal. Nearby, the crowd thickened along the road leading to Joppa, yet from its swirl a new group emerged, catching the attention. At their center, a man of undeniable nobility, his face radiant with health, his eyes alive with intelligence. His beard was long, oiled, and gleamed in the light. His garments, rich and suited to the season, clung perfectly to his frame. A golden seal hung from his neck, swaying with each step. His attendants, some armed, hovered around him in quiet reverence. Alongside them, 2 desert Arabs guided their horses through the crowd, their gaunt faces fierce and sun-darkened, their voices shrill and eager bartering. Though he let his servants speak on his behalf, the nobleman answered when needed, always with grace. As he passed through the gate, he paused to buy figs, his discerning taste noted by the fruit seller, who would later speak of him with awed respect, calling him a prince of the city, one who had wandered far and knew the finest fruits especially those kissed by the salt-sweet breezes of Cyprus. So the day passed, the city alive with movement, its gates flowing with a stream of pilgrims, merchants, and wanderers, representatives of every tribe of Israel, each sect and faction, every class of citizen, from the devout to the decadent. Jerusalem, once the jewel of Solomon's reign, where silver lay like stones and cedars lined the valleys, had changed. It had become a reflection of Rome, no longer a beacon of holiness, but a city of fractured faith, occupied by foreign gods and foreign rule. Long ago, a Jewish king had dared to step into the Holy of Holies and emerged cursed with leprosy. But now, a Roman conqueror had walked the same sacred space and found it empty. God, it seemed, had turned away. The listener is now invited to return to the marketplace court near the Joppa Gate. It was the third hour of the day. Though many had already moved on, the flow of people remained steady, unrelenting. Among the new arrivals stood a humble group near the southern wall, just a man, a woman, and a donkey. Yet their presence invited closer attention. The man held the donkey's strap and leaned against a sturdy stick, clearly crafted for both guiding and support. His clothing resembled that of the everyday Jewish people around him, though it appeared newer, freshly worn. His mantle draped from his head, and the long robe that covered him from neck to heel seemed like something reserved for Sabbath visits to the synagogue. His face, lined with years, revealed the experience of 5 decades, a guess easily confirmed by the gray strand streaking his otherwise dark beard. He scanned the scene with wide, uncertain eyes, the look of someone unaccustomed to the city's chaos. Beside him, the donkey chewed lazily on a generous bundle of fresh green grass, undisturbed by the crowd or noise. On its back, settled comfortably on a cushioned seat, sat the woman, her body draped entirely in a dull woolen cloak. A white wimple wrapped her head and neck, revealing almost nothing. Occasionally, she pulled it aside just slightly, curious about the sights or sounds nearby, but never enough for her face to be fully seen. Eventually, a passerby stepped close and recognized the man, addressing him. The man turned and acknowledged him calmly. It was a meeting between old acquaintances. A gesture of greeting followed, familiar and respectful. A hand pressed to the chest, a slight bow of the head, then a touch of the lips to the hand, and the palm placed upon the forehead, an exchange rooted in tradition. As they spoke, the other man remarked on the traveler's clean garments, guessing he had spent the previous night within Jerusalem. But the man explained that their journey had only brought them as far as Bethany before nightfall. They had rested at a roadside inn, continuing again at dawn. Hearing that the destination was Bethlehem, the other's expression darkened. What had been warm turned wary, even bitter. The mention of Roman-imposed registration stirred something within him. The old comparisons flowed freely. Israel's children likened once more to slaves in Egypt, but now with neither Moses nor Joshua to lead them out. The traveler listened quietly, standing still. His companion misunderstood the nature of his journey, assuming the woman beside him was his daughter, traveling with him for the census. But the man offered a simple correction. She was not his daughter. Still clinging to political frustration, the other man shifted the topic. He asked about the resistance movement brewing in Galilee, about the followers of Judas who whispered of a coming Messiah. But the traveler remained cautious. He was a carpenter, he said. His life revolved around wood and labor, not the clashes of power. His home in Nazareth sat quietly off the main roads. The disputes of parties did not reach his doorstep. Still, the questions came, especially about Judas and his growing reputation. The carpenter answered simply, stating only what he'd heard, nothing more. Just then, the woman adjusted her wimple more fully. For a fleeting second, her face became visible, young, luminous, and alive with interest. The other man caught a glimpse and faltered. Her beauty silenced him, even if just briefly. Assuming again, he called her the traveler's daughter. Again, the man clarified. She was not. She was the daughter of Joachim and Anna of Bethlehem, people well known for their lineage and reputation. Both had since passed away in Nazareth, leaving behind property to their daughters. This woman was one of them. To protect her inheritance, the law required that she marry her nearest male relative. And so, she became his wife, though he had once been her uncle. They had both been born in Bethlehem, which now explained the journey. The Roman census required them to return to their birthplace together. At this revelation, the other man, filled with righteous indignation, lifted his eyes to the heavens and invoked the justice of the God of Israel. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. A nearby stranger, having observed the exchange, leaned in and commented softly that the man was a zealot, fiery and unrelenting, much like Judas himself. The traveler, uninterested in continuing the conversation, gave no reply. He bent to gather the scattered grass the donkey had knocked aside, then leaned back upon his staff and waited. Within another hour, they had passed through the city gate and taken the winding road toward Bethlehem. The descent into the valley of Hinnom was rough and uneven, scattered with wild olive trees that clung to the rocky earth. With quiet care, the Nazarene walked beside the young woman, gently holding the strap that led the donkey. To their left, the ancient wall of Jerusalem stretched along Mount Zion, while to the right, the rugged slopes rose to mark the western edge of the valley. Their journey brought them slowly past the lower pool of Gihon, where the sun began chasing away the lingering shadows cast by the royal hill. Side by side, they followed the aqueduct, tracing its way from the pools of Solomon, until they reached the hillside where the country house once stood, on the ground now known as the Hill of Evil Counsel. From there, they began the ascent toward the broad, stony plain of Rephaim. The sun poured harsh light over the earth, and under its heat, Mary let fall her wimple and uncovered her head. As they moved on, Joseph recounted the tale of the Philistines caught off guard by David's warriors in that very plain. His voice was solemn and slow, marked by the steady tone of a man for whom stories were more duty than delight. Mary did not always seem to hear him. Wherever life carries people, whether over land or sea, the features of the Jewish people are recognized. Though the race has preserved a constant type, the eye of history has lingered on the rare variations. Now he was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance. The scriptures said of the son of Jesse, and ever since, imagination has shaped David's descendants in his image. Poets and painters alike have given them fair faces, chestnut hair shining like gold in sunlight, and eyes full of light. So, too, tradition has passed down such grace to the one now riding beside the man of Nazareth. She was no older than 15, with a voice, bearing, and grace just at the edge of girlhood. Her face was delicately oval, her complexion pale rather than fair. Her nose was flawless, and her lips, parted ever so slightly, were full and warm, shaped by trust and gentle affection. Her eyes, large and deeply blue, sat beneath long lashes and soft, drooping lids. Down her back, in the custom of Jewish brides, fell a river of golden hair, loose and glimmering in the light, reaching to the saddle upon which she rode. Her neck and throat bore that soft, downy look, an artist challenged to define whether it was texture or color that gave it such tender beauty. Yet more than all this, she carried an air of purity that could only come from within. She often lifted her eyes to the sky, as though searching for something greater, and often crossed her hands over her chest, lost in silent prayer. At times, she raised her head as if listening intently for a voice not of this earth. Joseph would glance at her now and then, his words trailing off when he saw her face alight with wonder, and, lost in thought, would fall silent and walk on. Their path led them across the great plain until they reached the rise of Mar-Elias. From that vantage point, they saw Bethlehem, ancient and enduring, its white stone buildings shining atop a ridge above the bare winter orchards. There they paused, and Joseph pointed out the places of sacred memory. Then they descended into the valley below, stopping at the old well, where David's mighty men had once performed a deed of courage and loyalty. The area was crowded, filled with travelers and beasts alike. A shadow of worry crept over Joseph. If so many had come before them, would there be any shelter left for the delicate Mary? Without hesitation, he pressed on, past the stone pillar marking Rachel's tomb, up the terrace slope, not pausing to greet a single passerby, until he came to the inn just outside the village gates, near the meeting of the roads. To fully grasp what took place at the Khan with the Nazarene, one must first understand that Eastern inns differed vastly from those in the Western world. These Khans, as they were called, originating from the Persian, were often nothing more than fenced enclosures without roofs or formal buildings. Frequently lacking even a proper gate, they were chosen for practical reasons like shade, water, or defensibility. They resembled the places where Jacob once rested on his way to find a wife in Padan Aram, and similar structures still dotted the desert roads. Some, especially those on major routes like the one connecting Jerusalem and Alexandria, were grand in scale, built as acts of royal devotion. But in general, they functioned less as inns and more as tribal centers. These khans served as marketplaces, workshops, and fortresses, accommodating not only travelers but also merchants, artisans, and entire communities engaged in daily commerce. What often startled visitors from the West was how unmanaged these places seemed. There were no innkeepers, no staff, not even a kitchen. At the entrance, a lone steward represented the only trace of authority. Guests arrived and stayed without questions. They brought their own food, utensils, and even bedding. The owner's responsibility extended only to providing water, shelter, and basic protection, always freely given. Despite their chaotic appearance, these khans upheld a sacred peace. Unlike synagogues, where disputes sometimes broke the silence, the khans maintained order. The entire property, down to the smallest well, was considered holy ground. The khan near Bethlehem, where Joseph and his wife approached, was an average example. Not overly primitive, yet far from luxurious. Built in classic Eastern style, it was a rectangular block of rough stone, flat-roofed and windowless, with a single main entrance on the eastern side. A rocky fence extended outward, forming a large enclosed area essential for keeping animals safe. Since Bethlehem had only one sheik, it had only one khan. Though Joseph was born there, years of absence meant he held no rights to hospitality. With the census looming, possibly stretching into weeks, he couldn't impose on friends or family. So, as he led the donkey up the dusty slope, anxiety grew. The road ahead was crowded with people herding animals and carrying goods. And as they drew near, the sight of a full enclosure and a throng at the entrance confirmed his fears. There would likely be no space. Joseph halted the donkey at a distance, hesitant to push through the crowd. His wife, quietly lifting her veil, peered at the scene ahead. Her weariness momentarily gave way to curiosity. It was a commotion typical of the highways frequented by caravans. Men yelling in various tongues, horses and camels jostling, peddlers hawking bread and wine, and children chasing dogs through the confusion. Yet the noise didn't hold her attention for long. Soon she sighed, settled on the pillion, and turned her gaze southward, toward the cliffs of the Mount of Paradise, now glowing gently in the light of the setting sun. Her eyes lingered there, as if seeking calm or waiting for something beyond this restless world. Amid the bustle, a man forced his way out of the crowd and stopped beside them, his expression grim. Joseph addressed him with solemn dignity. The man, recognizing a kindred spirit, responded respectfully. He identified himself as a native of Beth Dagon, once part of the tribe of Dan, and had returned for the census, though he admitted he had been bitter about the decree. Yet memories of the old hill, the valley of Cedron, the fertile lands of Boaz and Ruth, and the beloved mountains, Gitter, Gibeah, and Maralias, had softened his resentment. He had come back with his wife Rachel and their daughters, Deborah and Michael. As he spoke, he noticed Mary. Her face, turned upward toward the hill of Gitter, caught the light of the sinking sun. In her expression, there was a purity and radiance that seemed beyond earthly concerns, as though she were touched by something divine. The man, moved by her presence, pointed out his own family resting under a nearby olive tree and suggested Mary might join them. Then, turning back to Joseph, he warned gently but firmly, the khan was already full. It would be pointless to approach the gate. Joseph, slow in both will and thought, hesitated for a while before finally agreeing to the stranger's offer. Although uncertain about lodging, he decided they would go and meet the man's family. But first, he wished to speak with the gatekeeper himself. Handing over the donkey's strap, Joseph made his way into the crowd, determined to appeal personally. Outside the gate, the watchman sat atop a large cedar block, a javelin resting behind him and a dog at his side. Joseph greeted him with reverence, introducing himself as a native of Bethlehem and descendant of David. These words carried weight, for to be of David's line was among the highest honors a Hebrew could claim. It was a lineage preserved through sacred records, giving even the humblest descendant a place of reverence wherever they traveled. And for Joseph, this was not metaphor but truth. This was the very house of his ancestors, where Jesse raised David, where prophets once stood, and where kings were chosen. The gatekeeper, moved by this legacy, descended with quiet respect and offered to show Joseph the situation firsthand. Within the khan, every chamber, passage, and rooftop was overflowing. The court, though spacious, was cluttered with trade goods, silks, spices, and all manner of cargo. The gatekeeper, while sympathetic, reminded Joseph that many had arrived earlier, some waiting since midday. Bethlehem, overwhelmed by the census decree, had no accommodations left, not in the khan, nor in the surrounding town. Joseph listened with concern, his mind weighed down not by his own discomfort, but by the well-being of his young wife in the cold night air. He pleaded again, hoping the gatekeeper might recall her parents, once residents of Bethlehem and also of David's line. That memory softened the man's tone. Though he could offer no formal lodging, he vowed not to let them remain exposed on the ridgeline. When Joseph mentioned their group included another family from Beth Dagon, the keeper accepted all 6 and urged them to make haste before nightfall settled over the mountains. Joyfully, Joseph returned to Mary and the Beth Dagonite. Soon the rest of the group arrived, the women on donkeys, the daughters echoing the grace of their mother. As they approached the gate, the steward recognized their modest origins. He greeted Mary warmly, struck by her golden hair and blue eyes, features that stirred memories of the young David himself. Taking the lead strap, he guided them into the khan through a stone passageway and into the crowded court. Dark, yawning ruins surrounded them, and every inch of space overflowed with sleeping animals, merchants, and guards from many lands. They moved carefully through the maze of goods and beasts, finally turning toward a path that climbed toward a limestone bluff west of the khan. Joseph, with quiet resolve, noted that they were heading toward a cave. The guide stayed close to Mary and explained that the place once served as a shelter for her ancestor David, first as a shepherd, later as a king returning for rest. The stone mangers from his time still stood, unchanged by the centuries. Though humble, the cave offered sanctuary far better than the road or crowded court. As they neared its entrance, the simple stone house beside it came into view, promising refuge where history and faith gently met. The lodging offered to Joseph and his companions needed no apology. Though modest, it was the best that could be provided at the time. These travelers, accustomed to a simple way of life, were easily contented. For Jews of that era, taking shelter in caves was neither unusual nor degrading. It was part of their heritage. Stories of such dwellings echoed through Sabbath teachings in synagogues and were deeply woven into their history. Time and again, critical moments in Jewish history had taken place within caves. And for those from Bethlehem, like Joseph and Mary, the idea was especially familiar. Their land was scattered with ancient caves, large and small, some of which had served as homes since the days of the Emim and Horites. Even the fact that the cave had been used as a stable did not trouble them. Their ancestry traced back to herdsmen, for whom it was common to share living spaces with animals. That tradition lived on among the Bedouins, whose tents still sheltered both children and livestock. So, without offense or complaint, they followed the keeper willingly, curious and quietly reverent toward anything linked to the memory of David. The building they approached was small and low, extending only a little from the rock behind it. It had no windows and only a single door on its plain front. The ochre-covered door swung on massive hinges, and as the wooden bolt was drawn back, the women were gently helped down from their mounts. Once inside, it was clear the structure was simply a facade built over the entrance of a natural cave. The grotto extended roughly 40 feet deep, with a modest height and width. Light from the doorway revealed an uneven floor scattered with stored grain, fodder, earthen vessels, and various household items. Along the stone walls were mangers built low and sturdy, suitable for sheep, made from rock held together with cement. There were no dividers or animal stalls, only a rustic open space. The floor was blanketed in dust and chaff, which filled cracks in the stone and clung to cobwebs hanging from the ceiling like worn cloth. Yet, despite its rough appearance, the cave was clean and offered a quiet comfort comparable to the vaulted luins of the main khan. In truth, it was such caves that had originally inspired the design of those very shelters. The keeper invited them to make use of the resources inside, gesturing to the piles of straw and provisions on the floor, freely offered to travelers like themselves. He then turned to Mary, asking gently if the place would suffice. Her response, though quiet, carried a deep sense of peace and reverence. With that, the keeper took his leave, blessing them as he departed. Left to themselves, the small group turned to the simple but necessary task of making the cave their home for the night. Of an evening hour, the noise and bustle surrounding the khan gradually subsided. As if in shared reverence, every Israelite rose to his feet. Those already standing grew solemn in expression. They turned their gaze toward Jerusalem, folded their hands over their chests, and began to pray. It was the sacred 9th hour, a time when the temple on Mount Moriah received offerings, and God's presence was believed to dwell there. The hush of worship gave way again to activity. People turned to their evening meals or prepared their places for sleep. Not long after, the lamps were extinguished, and a blanket of silence covered the place. Then came sleep. But around midnight, the stillness was pierced by a cry from someone on the rooftop, rousing others from slumber with urgency. Eyes still heavy, the people stirred, blinking into the night sky. What they saw awakened them fully, flooding their hearts with astonishment. The murmurs from the rooftop spread below. Soon, everyone in the house, the courtyard, and even the distant enclosures stood together, gazing upward in wonder. There, in the heavens, a breathtaking sight unfolded, a great shaft of light descending from a height far beyond the stars, slanting toward the earth. It narrowed to a point high above and widened at the base into a broad and glowing foundation. The beam shimmered with gentle edges melting into the dark sky, while at its heart, an ethereal pink brilliance glowed like living fire. It appeared to settle on the southeastern mountain ridge, casting a ghostly crown of light along the summit. Even the calm below glowed under its touch, allowing the watchers on the roof to see each other's faces, each one marked by awe and disbelief. The strange radiance lingered, unmoving, minute after minute. Marvel turned to unease, and then to fear. The more faint-hearted trembled. Even the bravest lowered their voices to hushed tones. Some tried to explain. Perhaps it was a fire lit by shepherds to protect their flocks, or maybe a star had burst in the sky. A few were comforted by such thoughts, but the explanation quickly faded as others pointed out that even a vast blaze could not create such towering light. At last, a venerable old man stepped forward and declared, with reverence in his voice, that this was the very vision their forefather Jacob once saw in a dream, a ladder reaching between heaven and earth. And in that moment, the people could only lift their hearts in silent praise. 1.5 miles, maybe 2, southeast of Bethlehem, lay a quiet plain, separated from the town by a gentle rise in the mountain. Sheltered from the cold north winds, the valley was blanketed in trees, sycamores, dwarf oaks, and pines, while nearby ravines and glens overflowed with tangled growths of olive and mulberry. In this season, such foliage was precious, offering much-needed sustenance to the flocks of sheep, goats, and cattle that roamed these hills under their shepherd's care. Tucked beneath a bluff, farthest from the town, stood a time-worn Mara, a sheepfold, its walls still standing though its roof had long been destroyed in some forgotten raid. The stone enclosure mattered more than the building itself, tall enough to shield the flocks, but not so high that a hungry predator, lion or panther, couldn't leap inside. To guard against such threats, a thick, thorny hedge of rhamnus grew along the inner wall, its spiked branches so dense that not even a sparrow could pass through. On that very day, one filled with the sounds of axes, bleating sheep, clanging bells, and barking dogs, a group of shepherds had brought their flocks to graze here. By sunset, they had gathered them into the Mara, lit a fire near the gate, and, after a modest meal, settled in for the night. There were 6 of them, not counting the watchman, bareheaded, with sunburnt hair and coarse beards that spilled down their chests. They were wrapped in fleeced cloaks made from the skins of lambs and kids. Each carried a sling and a crook, symbols of their humble work and means of defense. Rough in appearance, like the lean dogs dozing beside them, they were gentle in spirit, simple men shaped by a life spent protecting the defenseless. They spoke quietly of their flocks, a subject that might seem dull to the world, but was everything to them. Each lamb was a bond, a charge taken from birth, raised with care, watched over through valleys and storms. The loss of one wasn't just a mishap, it was personal and painful. The world's grander affairs, the fall of empires, the rule of kings, barely touched their lives. They might hear distant rumors of Herod's extravagances or catch glimpses of Roman legions crossing the hills. But once the soldiers passed and the hills grew quiet again, they returned to their flocks, wondering at the mystery of a world so far removed from their own. Yet these men, with calloused hands and quiet faith, held a wisdom deeper than gold. On Sabbaths, they would cleanse themselves, climb to the synagogues, and sit at the back. No one listened more intently to the sacred scrolls. In the Shema, the simple truth that the Lord was one and must be loved with all the soul, they found all the law they needed. And they loved him deeply and purely, so much so that their hearts, more than the minds of kings, understood the ways of God. That night, beneath a clear winter sky sparkling with stars, the shepherds drifted into sleep one by one, the fire crackling low beside them. The air was crisp, the silence deep, a silence that felt sacred, as if heaven itself had drawn near, preparing to whisper a message of hope to the waiting earth. The watchman paced by the gate, clutching his mantle tightly around him against the night's cold. At times, he paused, alerted by a stirring among the sleeping herds or the distant cry of a jackal echoing from the mountain. Midnight felt painfully slow, yet at last the hour came. His long vigil was over, and he turned toward the fire, longing for the deep, dreamless sleep that labor bestows upon the weary. But something made him stop. A gentle, moon-like light began to form around him. He waited, frozen in place, his breath caught in awe. The light grew steadily stronger, and soon everything in the field, once hidden by the dark, stood clearly visible. A chill pierced him, sharper than the cold air, yet it came not from frost, but from fear. The stars above had vanished, and the mysterious glow seemed to descend from an invisible window in the heavens. What followed stunned him. The brightness intensified until it was blinding. He cried out in alarm, startling the dogs who ran off howling into the night. The flocks scattered in confusion, and the other men leapt to their feet, weapons ready, overwhelmed by the unearthly light. In its full brilliance, they fell to their knees, and then their faces, overcome by terror, their senses fading. But just then, a voice broke through the panic, calm, sweet, and utterly unlike anything human. Its soothing tone reached into the depths of their souls, quieting their fear and reviving their strength. Slowly, they rose to their knees and lifted their eyes. At the heart of the radiance stood a figure robed in brilliant white. Towering wings, folded gently behind, shimmered like polished pearl. A single star glowed upon the being's forehead, as bright and steady as the evening star. His hands were lifted in blessing, and his face radiated peace and beauty beyond earthly form. The shepherds, simple in spirit but firm in belief, had long spoken of heavenly messengers. In their hearts, they knew what they were witnessing. This was an angel of the Lord, like the one who had once appeared to the prophet by the river of Valai. The angel's message reached them with profound clarity. A Savior had been born that very day in the city of David. He was the Christ, the long-awaited Lord. And the sign given to them was simple yet wondrous. They would find a newborn child, wrapped in swaddling cloths, lying in a manger. The moment held stillness, allowing the message to sink deeply into their hearts. Then, without warning, the radiance surrounding the messenger turned a soft rose and began to shimmer. Above them, the sky filled with dazzling wings and radiant forms. A chorus rose, the voices of a multitude in perfect harmony, singing praises that seemed to shake the heavens, offering glory to God and proclaiming peace and goodwill upon the earth. The refrain echoed many times, each repetition more moving than the last. Then, lifting his eyes heavenward, the angel appeared to seek divine approval. His wings unfolded wide, brilliant above and shimmering below like mother of pearl. With silent grace, he rose upward and vanished, the light fading with him. Yet the sound of the song lingered, falling gently from the sky in waves of soft, distant harmony. The shepherds remained still for a long moment, dazed and silent. Then, slowly, understanding dawned among them. They recalled the message, the child born in Bethlehem, wrapped in cloth, laid in a manger. One by one, they realized there was only one place where such a manger might be found, the cave near the old khan in the town. Their decision was made. The Christ had come. The sign was clear. With hearts full of awe and devotion, they prepared to leave. Concern rose for their flocks, but faith prevailed. They believed the Lord himself would guard what they left behind. Urged on by a shared resolve, they rose together and set off across the hills, eager to witness the miracle foretold in the silence of that sacred night. They made their way around the mountain and moved silently through the sleeping town until they reached the gate of the khan. There, a man stood on watch, alert even at this late hour. The travelers shared what they had witnessed that night: strange wonders in the sky, sounds that stirred the soul, a message that seemed to transcend human understanding. The man, however, had only seen the light but heard nothing. He listened without conviction, skeptical of their urgency. Still, they urged him to follow, explaining their intent to visit the cave within the enclosure, believed to be the only place in Bethlehem where mangers could be found. Despite his doubt and the hint of scorn in his tone, he allowed them to pass through the courtyard, where others, too, were awake, murmuring about the brilliant light they had seen overhead. Inside the cave, the door stood open. A lantern glowed faintly within, casting gentle shadows across the rock walls. The visitors entered with quiet reverence. The watchman spoke briefly to the man known as Joseph and to his companion from Beth Dagon, conveying the travelers' purpose. They sought a newborn child, said to be wrapped in swaddling clothes and resting in a manger. Though the Nazarene remained largely unmoved, a flicker of emotion passed over his face. He turned and quietly indicated where the child lay. They were led to a humble manger, and there, just as described, the child rested, silent, still, like any newborn. Someone brought the lantern closer. The shepherds stood in awe, overcome by a presence they could neither explain nor deny. One of the women present gently lifted the infant and carried him to Mary, who lay nearby. As the child was placed in her arms, those gathered around gazed with reverence, their hearts swelling with something deeper than understanding. Among them, the shepherds felt certain the prophecy had come to life before their eyes. To them, this was no ordinary birth. Without hesitation, they fell to their knees, overcome with reverence and joy. Their worship was simple but pure, their belief unshaken. One by one, they pressed their lips to the edge of the mother's robe, a gesture of honor and deep humility. And then, filled with peace, they departed. As they passed through the khan, now stirring with curious onlookers, they spoke of what they had seen. Along the road back to the Mara, they echoed the words they had heard from the heavens, proclaiming glory to God and peace to the world. Word of the event spread swiftly. The strange light seen by so many gave weight to the shepherd's tale. In the days that followed, the cave became a place of gathering. Crowds came, some moved to quiet belief, others dismissing it with laughter and doubt. Yet for those who had stood in that stillness before the newborn child, the moment remained eternal. On the 11th day following the child's birth in the cave, as the afternoon sun began its descent, 3 travelers, regal in bearing and otherworldly in appearance, drew near to Jerusalem by the road from Shechem. They crossed the brook Cedron, their camels towering and stately, adorned with silver bells that chimed gently in rhythm with their measured steps. The sight stirred curiosity among the townsfolk, for despite Jerusalem's constant stream of travelers from across the world, these 3 figures stood apart. Their garments spoke of distant lands, and their demeanor carried an air of sacred purpose. Children by the roadside clapped in delight at the brightness of the bells and the majesty of the white camels. The animals' elegance and the travelers' refined presence hinted at long journeys through vast deserts, sustained by both wealth and unwavering intention. Yet more captivating than their appearance was the question they asked again and again along the way. As they entered the fertile approach to Jerusalem, rich with olive groves and worn paths, they paused before a group resting near the ancient tombs of the kings. From the lead canopy, a figure leaned forward and asked whether they were close to the city. The response confirmed they were near, but what followed was far more intriguing. They spoke of a star they had seen in the east, a celestial sign marking the birth of one destined to be king of the Jews. Their words, spoken with quiet conviction, left the listeners puzzled, unaware of such a birth or any prophecy fulfilled. Undeterred, the travelers continued, repeating their question to all they passed. Each encounter ended in the same way: confusion, silence, disbelief. Yet their message began to stir something deeper. Those who had heard them turned back and followed, their curiosity piqued by the mystery and by the travelers' solemn determination. A large crowd formed, flowing with them toward the gates of Jerusalem. The view that unfolded ahead, the gleaming hills, the terraced Temple Mount, and the white palaces crowning Zion, might have awed any other visitor. But the three were consumed with the purpose that had driven them from distant lands. The grandeur of Herod's walls, the towers of Phasaelus, Miriam, and Hippicus, the regality of Mount Moriah, all faded behind the question that burned in their hearts. At last, they reached a great tower overseeing the northern gate, where Roman soldiers kept watch. The gathering crowd made passage difficult, and the sight of such noble visitors brought all attention to a halt. A Roman officer, summoned by the commotion, stepped forward to inquire about their purpose. Once again, the same question was posed. Where was he who had been born king of the Jews? The officer, uncertain and taken aback, spoke of Herod, whose kingship was Roman appointed. The idea of another king, one foretold by the stars, perplexed him deeply. He suggested the travelers turn to the temple priests, or better still, to Herod himself. If such a king existed, surely he would take interest. With that, the officer cleared the way. The wise men passed through the gate, followed still by the murmuring crowd, before disappearing into the winding streets. One of them looked to his companions and remarked that their presence had already been declared. By midnight, the entire city would echo with whispers of their mission. And so, they resolved to seek rest of the Khan. The journey far from over, the question still unanswered, but the search for the newborn king now fully begun. That evening, before the sun had fully set, a group of women gathered at the upper steps that descended into the quiet basin of the Pool of Siloam. They were busy washing clothes, each kneeling before a wide earthen bowl. Nearby, a young girl stood at the foot of the steps, cheerfully singing as she fetched water to fill their jars. Her light-hearted song seemed to ease the rhythm of their work. Now and then, the women paused, sitting back on their heels, gazing toward the slope of offal, and casting their eyes around to the crest of the Mount of Offense, where the fading light of the sun still lingered, casting a soft, golden hue. As they rubbed and wrung the garments with steady hands, two other women approached, each balancing an empty water jar on her shoulder. Their arrival stirred a gentle exchange of greetings. The women, though weary, spoke of the day drawing to a close. One remarked on the endlessness of work, while another reminded the others of the value of rest and of listening to what news might be circulating. Then, almost hesitantly, the new arrival shared something remarkable, something that instantly captured everyone's attention. They spoke of a story that was quickly spreading, whispered across the streets of Jerusalem, that the Christ had been born. The laborers' faces lit up with sudden interest. In unison, the newcomers placed their jars down, sitting atop them, as if ready to share a tale worth the end of a day's work. The report came with vivid details. Earlier that very afternoon, 3 men were seen crossing Brook Cedron, coming from the direction of Shechem. Each of them rode atop a pure white camel, larger than any previously known in the city. Everything about them had seemed extraordinary. They sat beneath silk canopies, and their saddles were adorned with gold buckles. Even the fringe of their bridles gleamed with gold, while silver bells chimed soft music with each movement. No one recognized them. Their presence felt foreign, as if they had journeyed from the furthest corners of the earth. Of the 3, Only one had spoken. And to every person he encountered, men, women, even children, he posed a single question: the whereabouts of a newborn who was to be king of the Jews. Those on the road had offered no answers, unaware of the meaning behind the inquiry. So the men had continued onward, leaving behind only their mysterious statement, something about having seen his star in the east and traveling far to worship him. At the city gate, even the Roman guard had been confused, eventually directing the strangers to Herod himself. By now, it seemed they had taken shelter at Khan. Word had spread rapidly, drawing crowds to catch a glimpse of the travelers. Many speculated about their origins. Some believed they were Persians, astrologers, or wise men who studied the stars. Others thought of them as prophets in the likeness of Elijah or Jeremiah. Curiosity deepened when the question arose: what do they mean by King of the Jews? And the answer followed softly: they meant the Christ, and they believed he had just been born. Yet not everyone responded with faith. One woman laughed gently and returned to her washing, deciding she would only believe when she saw him with her own eyes. Another agreed, saying she would wait until he raised the dead. A third, more thoughtful, simply said that if he could heal even a single leper, that would be proof enough. And so they remained, sitting and talking beneath the darkening sky. Eventually, as the night grew colder and the frosty air wrapped around them, they gathered their things and made their way home, carrying with them the wonder of what they had heard. Later that evening, just as the first watch began, a solemn gathering took place within the palace on Mount Zion. Nearly 50 individuals had assembled, figures of great authority and learning, summoned only by the direct command of Herod himself. These men did not meet lightly. They were called upon solely when the king sought to penetrate the deeper, often hidden mysteries of Jewish law and ancient history. The assembly included revered teachers of colleges, high-ranking priests, and learned doctors, each a leader of thought in Jerusalem. From the stern Sadducees to the rhetorical Pharisees and the soft-spoken, Stoic Essene philosophers, all schools of doctrine were represented. They gathered in a vast chamber nestled within one of the inner courtyards of the palace. Designed in Roman fashion, the room bore no windows, its walls adorned with saffron yellow fresco panels. A tessellated marble floor lay beneath their feet, while a large U-shaped divan, covered in bright yellow cushions, formed the central seating. In the curve of that U stood an imposing bronze tripod, its surface richly inlaid with gold and silver. Suspended above, a chandelier with 7 arms cast a warm glow from oil-lit lamps. Despite the Roman structure, these interior features carried the unmistakable mark of Jewish tradition. The men reclined upon the divan in typical Eastern style, dressed in robes that differed only in color. Most were elderly, their faces dominated by thick beards, large hooked noses, and solemn eyes shaded beneath prominent brows. The atmosphere was heavy with dignity, a gathering not unlike the ancient Sanhedrin itself. At the head of the circle sat a figure who demanded silent reverence. Though once formed in powerful proportions, time had shrunk and hollowed his frame into something nearly skeletal. His white robe draped loosely over shoulders that betrayed no sign of strength, and his silk sleeves concealed hands folded gently upon his knees. When he spoke, it was only a trembling finger that moved, slow and deliberate. Yet, for all his frailty, his head remained magnificent, a polished dome of intellect. Sparse, silver strands framed a skull wide and noble. Deep hollows marked his temples, and his forehead jutted forward like the weathered edge of a cliff. His eyes were faded, his features gaunt, and his flowing beard gave him the aura of ancient wisdom. This was Hillel the Babylonian, foremost among scholars in all of Israel, an heir to the prophetic lineage, though the voice of divine inspiration had long fallen silent. At 106 years old, he still held the position of rector of the great college. In front of him rested an unrolled scroll, inscribed with sacred Hebrew letters. Behind his seat, a young attendant stood quietly, clad in garments that bespoke his role in the court. The debate had reached its end, the final thoughts had been weighed, and the chamber fell into composed stillness. Without rising or shifting, the old master summoned the page with a barely audible breath of command. At once, the boy understood and departed, bearing their readiness to the king who waited beyond. After a while, two officers entered the hall and positioned themselves silently on either side of the door. Then came a figure of extraordinary presence, an elderly man draped in a flowing robe of royal purple, richly trimmed with scarlet. Around his waist, a golden belt was wrapped, its links so finely crafted that it draped like soft leather. His sandals glittered with embedded jewels. Upon his head rested a filigree crown, narrow and delicately wrought, set atop a crimson tar bush that cascaded down his neck and shoulders, exposing his throat and the upper chest. Instead of a royal seal, a dagger hung from his belt, and his step was uncertain, his frame leaning heavily upon a carved staff. He did not glance up until he reached the entrance of the divan. Then, as if suddenly aware of those present, he lifted his head and cast a piercing, suspicious gaze around the room. His eyes were filled with dark intensity, alert and searching, as though seeking out an enemy in hiding. This was Herod the Great, his body weakened by disease, his conscience hardened by years of guilt, his mind still vast in capacity, and his ambition matching the might of Caesar's. At 67 years old, he remained more vigilant than ever, ruling with relentless authority and merciless cruelty. A rustle passed through the gathering. The elder members bowed in respectful salaam, while the more refined rose to their feet, performing gestures of reverence with hands placed upon their beards or pressed to their chests. Herod's cold eyes scanned the assembly, and then he slowly advanced to where the aged Hillel sat across from him. The old sage acknowledged the king with a calm tilt of the head and a faint rise of the hands in solemn greeting. Herod paused before him, planting his staff firmly into the floor with both hands. His intention was clear, though his words were few, the expectation for an answer unmistakable. Hillel's eyes sparkled gently as he looked directly into the ruler's face. His manner, at first, was almost like a blessing, invoking peace and the memory of patriarchs long past. Then, with quiet authority, he spoke on behalf of himself and the scholars around him, all in agreement. The long-awaited Christ, he declared, would be born in Bethlehem of Judea. Hillel motioned toward the ancient parchment laid before him, his aged fingers trembling as he pointed to the words of the prophet. The prophecy, clear and unwavering, proclaimed that from Bethlehem would come a leader destined to guide the people of Israel. A visible tension settled on Herod's face. He stared at the parchment, lost in heavy thought. The silence in the room deepened. No one moved, no one spoke. Finally, the king turned without a word and left the chamber. Understanding that the audience had concluded, Hillel quietly signaled to his companions that they were dismissed. The assembly rose and began to depart in small, thoughtful groups. Hillel then softly called for Simeon, a man in the strength of middle age, who came promptly to his side. With care and reverence, the sacred parchment was rolled and secured under Hillel's guidance. The old man then accepted Simeon's steady arm, and with slow, fragile steps began his departure from the hall. Thus withdrew the revered rector, accompanied by Simeon, his faithful son and chosen successor, destined to carry on the legacy of wisdom and sacred duty. Later that evening, the wise men lay awake under the stone arch of the Khan, their heads slightly raised by the rocks they used as pillows. Beyond the dark silhouette of the Lewin, the sky stretched vast and still, sprinkled with starlight. Their eyes searched that silent firmament, hoping for the next divine sign. They had reached Jerusalem, had spoken of the birth they witnessed in the heavens, and now, all that remained was to find the one they had come so far to seek. With hearts attuned to the will of heaven, they waited, not with sleep, but with expectation. For those who await the voice of God rarely find rest. In the stillness, a figure stepped beneath the arch, momentarily casting a shadow across the Lewin. His arrival stirred the travelers, and as he declared the urgency of his message, they understood that the moment they had sensed approaching was now upon them. The man was none other than the steward of the Khan, bringing word from King Herod himself. A messenger awaited them outside with a royal summons. Without hesitation, the wise men rose, adjusted their mantles, and prepared to depart. One among them discreetly instructed the steward to ready their camels and supplies, in case sudden departure became necessary. The gesture revealed a quiet wisdom, an understanding that divine signs sometimes demanded haste. The messenger led them through the narrow lanes of Jerusalem. Though ancient and shadowed, the city bore the marks of a ruler who valued not only grandeur but order and cleanliness. Silently, they followed the guide through winding streets, beneath arches and bridges, ascending gradually until they reached the entrance of a guarded portal. Flames from twin braziers lit the path, casting flickering gold across soldiers who stood like statues. Without challenge, the travelers passed through. Their steps echoed through a palace of great complexity, arched hallways, inner courts, and towering colonnades. They climbed stair after stair until they arrived in a high tower chamber, where a rich perfume of sandalwood filled the air. Lavish furnishings surrounded them: golden candlesticks, Grecian-style wall paintings, velvet couches, and musical instruments unused yet present. In the center stood a plush rug, and upon it a throne. Herod the Great sat waiting, draped in the same regal attire as earlier that day. The travelers approached in silence and prostrated themselves before the throne. Herod acknowledged their reverence, then offered them seats. In his voice was curiosity veiled in courtesy. He spoke of the rumors that reached him from the north gate, of foreign travelers mounted unlike any in the land, and asked plainly whether they were those men. The wise men confirmed their identity, each introducing himself by name, land, and journey, yet holding back what they truly sought. Herod's questions turned sharper. He inquired about what they had asked at the city gate, and the answer unsettled him. They had spoken of a child, one born king of the Jews. The king, caught in a brief moment of visible distress, seemed shaken, as though haunted by memories too dark to name. Yet he pressed on, asking for more details. The wise men could only confess they had not yet found the child, but were led by signs from heaven. What they offered was a riddle Herod could not ignore. His tone shifted to one of false generosity. He pledged assistance, promising royal favor, mentorship, even intervention with Caesar himself. If only they would reveal how they had all come to know of this child, despite being from distant, unconnected lands. With quiet solemnity, Balthasar rose to speak. He declared that their journey had been commanded by none other than the Almighty. It was God who showed them the star. It was His Spirit that led them across deserts and seas. And it was that same Spirit, alive and present, that now guided them within the walls of Herod's palace. A powerful emotion took hold of the three travelers. The Greek could barely restrain himself from crying out, while Herod's eyes moved sharply between them, suspicion tightening his features. His sense of unease only grew stronger. He demanded further explanation, pressing them to reveal what was to come after the arrival of this new king. In solemn reverence, they conveyed that the world would witness the salvation of mankind, not through war or rule, but through deliverance from human wickedness. This transformation, they revealed, would come by divine means, through faith, through love, and through good works. The king paused, his expression unreadable. His gaze lingered with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty as he inferred that these travelers were no ordinary visitors, but messengers, heralds of the one called the Christ. In response, Balthasar bowed deeply, humbling himself before the throne. They made it clear. They were only servants, servants to the truth and to peace. Summoning an attendant, Herod instructed that gifts be brought forth. Shortly thereafter, the man returned and knelt before the guests, presenting each of them with richly colored outer robes, robes of scarlet and blue, along with golden girdles. The travelers received these honors with dignified bows and gestures of the East, showing both gratitude and grace. Still intrigued, Herod revisited something they had spoken of earlier, a star seen in the East. Balthasar affirmed it gently. It was not just a star, but his star, the sign of a birth long foretold. When questioned about the time of its appearance, Balthasar revealed that the vision had come just as they were called on their journey. Satisfied that the audience was ending, Herod rose from his throne. With regal courtesy, he stepped forward and addressed them as honored men. He explained that he had already consulted his wisest counselors, who confirmed that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem of Judea. With a voice full of royal diplomacy, he encouraged them to go there, to seek the child with devotion and care, and to return with word of where he might also worship this newborn king. He assured them that no obstacle would hinder their path. Then, drawing his robe tightly around him, Herod left the chamber. Soon, their guide returned and escorted them through the silent streets back to the khan. At the entrance, the Greek was the first to speak with urgency in his heart. He urged that they journey to Bethlehem without delay. The Hindu echoed his passion, overcome by a burning sense of divine purpose. Balthasar, too, with equal resolve, gave his agreement. The camels were ready. After offering gifts to the steward, they mounted their steeds, accepted guidance toward the Joppa gate, and departed. As they approached the city gates, the massive wooden doors were unbarred for them. They passed out into the open wilderness, following the very path that Joseph and Mary had taken only days before. As they rose out of the valley of Hinnom onto the broad plain of Rephaim, a soft glow emerged in the distance. At first, it was faint and scattered, but then it grew stronger, surging with light. Their hearts quickened with awe. The brilliance became blinding, forcing them to cover their eyes. And when they dared to look again, there it was, the star, radiant and flawless, not far above the horizon, moving gently ahead of them. With wonder overwhelming them, they folded their hands, their voices lifted in joyous praise. The words echoed over and over again in celebration, carrying them forward all the way to the valley beyond Mar Elias, where the star came to a halt, hovering above a simple house set upon the hillside near the town. It was the beginning of the third watch, and in Bethlehem, the first pale glow of morning had begun to rise beyond the eastern mountains. Yet the valley remained cloaked in darkness. On the rooftop of the old khan, a solitary watchman stood trembling in the chill air, straining his ears for those familiar sounds of waking life that usually whispered in the dawn. But what reached him instead was a strange light climbing the hill toward the house. At first, it seemed a torch held by some traveler. Then it appeared as a falling star, but its radiance swelled far beyond earthly light until it revealed itself to be a blazing star. In fear, the watchman cried out, drawing the others from their rest. One by one, they climbed to the rooftop. The heavenly body approached with a motion that defied reason, casting blinding beams over rocks, trees, and the very road beneath it. So fierce was its brilliance that many fell to their knees, covering their faces in awe and prayer, while others dared only fleeting glances through covered eyes. And when at last the khan and all within it lay bathed in unearthly splendor, those who looked saw the star pause directly above the humble house that stood in front of the cave where the child had been born. At the height of this miraculous vision, 3 strangers arrived, leading their camels to the gate. Their voices broke the silence, calling for entrance. The steward, overwhelmed by the celestial event, struggled to compose himself before unbarring the gate. The camels appeared almost ghostly in the strange light, and the travelers themselves were marked by a fervent anticipation that seemed to shine through their faces. Their presence stirred the keepers' fears and curiosity alike. Though hesitant at first, the others gathered courage and responded to the visitors' questions. Soon, murmurs spread. Bethlehem lay ahead, but within the khan, yes, there was indeed a child, newly born. Led by the glimmering star and by trembling hands, the strangers moved through the courtyard, followed by an ever-growing crowd. Many were drawn forward by awe, while some held back, afraid of what lay ahead. As they neared the cave, the star lifted and began to fade into the sky. By the time they reached the door, it hovered high above, then vanished altogether. And those who witnessed this knew with certainty that there was a divine connection between the visitors, the sign above, and the child within. When the door opened, all who could enter pressed inside. Inside, the chamber was dimly lit by a simple lantern. There, the mother sat quietly, the child awake in her lap. One of the travelers, recognizing her devotion and the peace on her face, asked if the infant was hers. With a tenderness shaped by sacred wonder, she raised the child into the soft glow of light. And so it was confirmed, he was indeed her son. The 3 travelers knelt, their hearts full of reverence. They saw no crown upon the child, no divine radiance surrounding him, no words from his lips. Like all infants, he stared curiously at the flickering light rather than the kneeling strangers. Yet without question or hesitation, they bowed in worship. They returned to their camels and brought forth the gifts they had carried across deserts and kingdoms: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These offerings they laid before the child with all the honor their spirits could convey. Though no words remain recorded from that sacred moment, it is known that their worship was not unlike the worship of pure hearts in all generations, an unspoken hymn flowing from divine faith. And so it was. The Savior they had journeyed so far to find lay in that quiet room, as helpless and silent as any newborn. Yet they worshipped him without doubt or demand. Their faith was built not on what they saw, but on the signs they had received, signs given by the one whom future generations would call the Father. They had no need to question his ways, for in that moment, belief rested solely on divine promise. Only a few had been given those signs: the mother, Joseph, the shepherds, and these 3, but their hearts were united in faith. In this early chapter of the world's redemption, God was all, and the child still veiled in mystery. But a time would come when the signs would no longer flow from heaven alone, but from the child himself. Blessed, indeed, will be those who believe in that coming day. Let the world wait and hope for that time. And so ends the first book of this sacred tale, a journey that brought kings across deserts, guided by nothing but a star, to kneel before a child who did not speak, yet whose silence carried the promise of eternity. They saw no miracles that night, no crown, no light in the heavens, except that which had already led them there. And still they believed. But this is only the beginning. Ahead lies a path shaped by destiny, trials, revelations, and the unfolding of a divine plan that will change the world forever. We will return very soon with the next part of this eternal story. Until then, let your heart remain still, your faith unwavering, and your eyes fixed toward the promise that began in Bethlehem. The journey continues,